plays a key role right in the middle of Eurasian politics. And specifically, Kazakhstan is a major ally of Russia and China. And this, of course, is one of the main reasons why this January 2022, there was a violent coup attempt in Kazakhstan. And it really is a kind of textbook example of what is called a color revolution. Now, the term color revolution goes back to the overthrow of the Soviet Union, in which the US, the CIA, and CIA cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy played a key role, and also in the overthrow of the socialist governments in the Eastern Bloc, the governments that were members of the Warsaw Pact. Poland is a key example of this. The Polish People's Republic, the socialist government in Poland, was overthrown partially thanks to this fake union called Solidarity that was backed by the CIA. It was funded by the CIA, and it was funded also through the National Endowment for Democracy, which I talk about a lot in my videos and my articles of journalism, my reporting. And the NED funneled money to Solidarity, and the Catholic Church supported it to wage a color revolution. So what are the hallmarks of color revolutions? So-called NGOs, which are called non-governmental organizations, but in reality are funded by Western governments, funded by CIA cutouts. So in reality, they should be called quasi-governmental organizations, QGOs, or just called GOs, governmental organizations. But NGOs play a key role in destabilizing governments where Washington wants regime change. And then you have a media attack. You have corporate media propaganda about the horrible authoritarian regime and dictatorship that needs to be overthrown. And then you have calls for foreign intervention. And then you have the government is overthrown. And then you have Western governments appoint a transitional figure, an interim leader like Juan Guaido in Venezuela. So we saw a series of color revolutions in the former constituent republics of the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union was overthrown, there were many governments that were still friendly to Russia. Some of them were actually still led by social democratic or even socialist parties. So there were a series of color revolutions, which are soft coups. That's what they are. They're soft coups. They involve some degree of violence, usually, but they also involved protests. And sometimes there are legitimate protests, but then those legitimate protests are co-opted, are manipulated, and are used along with extreme violent elements and assassinations and terrorism. And then altogether, it's this formula that the CIA has mastered, the National Endowment for Democracy has mastered, Washington and Brussels have mastered to overthrow foreign governments that don't bow down to their interests, that refuse to cut ties with Russia and China. And Kazakhstan is a key example of this. Now, unlike Venezuela and Nicaragua and Cuba and China, Kazakhstan doesn't have a socialist government by any stretch of the imagination. There's certainly a lot to criticize about the Kazakhstan government, the Kazakhstani government, which has had a lot of issues with corruption and actually played a complex game until recently of trying to play Russia and China against the West. But it still is a key ally of Russia and a key ally of China in the heart of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So even though Kazakhstan had good relations with both Russia and China and the West, for the West, they accept nothing other than total submission. The US empire would refuse a Kazakhstani government that has any positive relations with Russia and China, especially one that has very close relations with Russia and China. As an example of this, here's an article that was published in the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. This is one of those DC Beltway think tank blob outlets, and it's part of the US empire's foreign policy apparatus. And the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace is, of course, funded by the US government. This was published back in 2018. And the headline is, Kazakhstan must look beyond the Belt and Road. And they say that the former president, Nazarbayev, needs to interest other powers to avoid over-dependence on China.